African governance structure through strategic diplomacy and security. Our special guest here with us today to help expound more on today's topic is His Excellency Ambassador Michael Battle. And I would like to introduce him and to all of us here tonight and say a little bit about what he has done. He is a former US ambassador to the African Union. He has served, or among other things that he has done, he has served almost every level of academia, from instructor in philosophy and religion, university chaplain, associate vice president, to president of a major theology seminary. He has served as a US
Hello?
Hello.
Yes, I think I'm still here, but I think we lost her.
Ambassador Battle is also responsible for the State Department Policy Liaison Office, managing the diplomatic side of the summit, engaging with the African embassies in Washington, D.C. and New York, as well as with the US embassies in African countries. Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah.
Oh, when did anybody lose me? Okay, I think I found it. We were talking about his non-academic work, which includes 20 years as a US Army Reserve chaplain, retiring with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. His continued service includes serving as a US ambassador to the African Union and US representative to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and senior advisor to the State Department for the US Africa Leaders Summit hosted by President Obama. From January 2015 to January 2017, Ambassador Michael Battle served as Executive Vice President at the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Freedom Center provides academic and experimental arguments, engagements on the broad issues of international freedom and combating international slavery. In 2014, Ambassador Battle served as senior advisor to the African Bureau of US. Would everybody please kindly mute themselves? Except for our guest, of course. Ambassador Battle was responsible for the State Department Policy Liaison Office, managing the diplomatic side of the summit, engaging with the African embassies in Washington, D.C. and New York, as well as with US embassies in African countries. He also managed the diplomatic contact with the African Union mission to the US and the US mission to the African Union on matters related to the African Leaders Summit. Ambassador Battle was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the US Senate to serve as the United States ambassador to the African Union from 2009 to 2013. His responsibilities were expanded in 2010 to include serving as US permanent representative to the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa from 2010 to 2013. Both the AU and the UNECA are headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The African Union, his academic, may I continue?
Yeah, you probably have read enough of the bio. We can go on with your program if it's okay.
We can. Oh, thank you so much. His Excellency Ambassador Michael Battle is here to discuss the topic on diplomacy mostly, and to expound further. He will be helped by our host, the founder and president of African Rebirth, Mr. Enoch. Yes, and everybody will, their conversation will last approximately 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll follow a Q&A section. So yes, over to Mr. Enoch, as well as our Ambassador Michael Battle.
Thank you for your kind introduction.
Thank you so much, Matilea, for engaging our audience and reading out a very elaborative bio for Ambassador Michael. Mike, I welcome you to African Rebirth. Thank you for accepting our kind invitation to share your long experience, rich experience of diplomacy, international affairs, and generally the leadership experience you've acquired decades and decades. So I welcome you. And our today's topic, just to remind you, is restructuring African governance through strategic diplomacy and security. And when you hear that, for our audience, I just want to let you know about the audience. These are young African leaders from from all parts of Africa. And they're here for the 6 weeks of training. We're trying to creating young leaders who are, experienced in diplomacy, international affairs, but also with a great zeal for New Africa. And, these are the great leaders of tomorrow and today. And so just to brief you about what's our audience about. And some are working with the governments, international organization, also business people, and some are students. So welcome. So to open it up, I just want to ask you an opening question. What's diplomacy? When you hear the word diplomacy, what are the forms? What are the etiquettes of diplomacy? Before we even dive into the main topic. Yeah.
Well, first, let me express my deep appreciation to you and to the audience that you have, and to share how proud I am of the fact that there are young people throughout the African continent who are concerned about the leadership of the continent, not only the continent, but also the leadership of the world. It has been my strong belief, and continues to be, that every issue that faces Africa has international consequences, and every issue that faces any other place in the international community has African consequences. So there's no way that one can separate being a leader on the African continent from being a leader in the larger global community. So I applaud your audience for its leadership, not only its future leadership, but for the current engagement in shaping what the future of the world is going to be like, particularly when you consider the fact that most of the young people on planet Earth are living in Africa. So the future of the world depends upon an intentional, active, purposeful engagement of African leadership. Now to your question, what is diplomacy? Diplomacy, there are standard academic definitions for diplomacy, and then there's the basic definition of diplomacy that I love, that was given by Vice President Kamala Harris in the debates prior to the last election. She mentioned that diplomacy is about relationships. It's about establishing connectivity, nation to nation, and just as importantly, person to person. One cannot sway national direction if one does not have the capacity to sway interpersonal relationships one-on-one. For example, if you're representing South Africa and I'm representing the United States of America, and if the two of us have absolute disdain for each other, it doesn't matter what our nations want to accomplish. If that personal relationship is not there, neither one of us will convince the other. So diplomacy is about relationships. It's the ability to sustain a relationship in the best interest of one's own nation and in the best interest of the global community. Now, of course, I could give philosophical definitions because I taught philosophy for so long, but I'd rather be personal with you in terms of how I interpret diplomacy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And true, diplomacy is about fostering relationships and maintaining relationships. And that's why at African Rebirth, we emphasize networking, intentional relationships, because it's how you keep relationships, because relationship foster easy work, it creates teamwork, gets things done, so it's very important. I'm glad that as an experienced diplomat, you're also cementing the value of relationships. So, but one can say, okay, do I wake up one day, I inbox Ambassador Michael and I create relationship, and that's diplomacy? What are the etiquettes of diplomacy? What are the forms of diplomacy? Yes.
Right. No, I don't think anybody wakes up one morning and decides I'm going to establish a relationship with John Doe, and through that relationship, we're going to accomplish diplomatic things.
Right.
In order to do things diplomatically, one has to have the sanction and approval of his or her nation. For example, I cannot come to Nigeria uninvited by the Nigerian government. That's why diplomats have agreement, which is the agreement of the nation to receive you. After you have been appointed by your government, and in the US system, you have been confirmed by the Senate, which means then you have the authority of your nation to engage in diplomatic relations. But if my nation gives me the authority to relate to Nigeria or Tanzania or South Africa or any place on the African continent, but if that government does not give agreement or agreement, then it's a connection that doesn't work. So you have to have some authority to operate. Then one would assume that you would have to have a broad knowledge and appreciation of international affairs, broad enough to be able to relate cognitively as well as emotively when you are working with people from different countries. You also have to have a sense of sensitivity, the ability to recognize the uniqueness and profound depth of different cultural traditions without judging a cultural tradition over against the backdrop of your own culture. And I think that's the mistake that so many people make. They assume that they could work with people from other contexts and impose their own context on that other context. You can't do that. You have to recognize with respect and honor the position that other people are bringing to you. So diplomacy is always fluid because power dynamics change, sets of approval change. The persons with whom you are engaging will change in the process. So you have to be as fluid as a river, able to change and flow as things are developing.
Perfect submission, perfect. Just like you said, diplomacy is not, you can have some kind of authority, it's not an individual.
Yes.
And now people are wondering, because from a layman's perspective, when you hear like so-and-so is a diplomat, may not know, like if you're not engaged in government, if you're not engaged in a high-level multilateral organization, or if you're not an academic in the diplomatic world, what's the core importance of diplomacy? What's the core importance and purpose of diplomacy between nations in multilateral organizations? Right. And why should really young people look into that direction to develop as a career, to develop as a mission?
Okay. Let's start with the last part, why I think young people should have an interest in diplomacy. I want to go back a little bit. I made my very first speech about international relations back in 1967 when I was in high school. I was a junior in high school. And the issue then was the Ian Smith government in Rhodesia, long before Zimbabwe was ever born. Rhodesia. And Ian Smith had the ludicrous audacity and absolute ignorance to propose that all Zimbabwean-born women would be sterilized after having their first child, meaning they would be unable to have any other children. So as a 17-year-old young American student from St. Louis, Missouri, I was so angered and incensed. And I was a part of the Model United Nations, and we were debating the issues on the African continent at the time. And I stood up and made an impassioned speech about why Ian Smith was absolutely wrong, why it was inhumane, insensitive, and I probably used the word stupid, but why it made no sense. So from that engagement as a 17-year-old, I began to understand the dynamics of the world, that the world impacts your hometown, whether you know it or not. There are implications of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine now that impacts the whole world. There are issues in what's going on in South and Central America that impacts the whole world. So if your audience is going to be engaged in leadership in the future and now, diplomacy offers an opportunity for working with other people in the global community. Yeah, I'm also a retired military person, a retired lieutenant colonel, so I know that often war happens when diplomacy fails. And diplomats help to prevent war. And diplomats also help to end war once war begins. So for me, diplomacy is a way to shape the global community in a constructive, informative, and engaging way that allows leaders to grow and to shape the rest of the world. One short example, at the African Union, the African Union has this concept of a contract or a governance agreement on good governance that once ratified by 15 nations on the African continent becomes continental policy. Well, it's been ratified now by about 30 different nations, 30, 40 nations. So continental policy has grown and developed to validate Africa's interest as a continent in good governance. Well, diplomacy made that happen. Not war, not argumentation, not frustration and fighting, but diplomacy makes that happen. So shape the world in which you live through diplomatic engagement. Shape the university campus on which you to which you attend by diplomatic relations with other people on your campus.
Excellent passion submission. And what caught my attention is when you're in high school, a 17-year-old, being engaged at that global audience, what was happening in Rhodesia, northern and southern Rhodesia. And so it's good that you're telling the young people who are not actually 17, a bit older than that, so that, that it's not too late to be engaged at international affairs, bringing out yourself there and really conscious about the global perspectives and global things that is taking place. So Ambassador Michael's career of diplomacy started when he was 17 by eloquently stating the discomforting side comments Smith was making about Rhodesia. So it's now, it begins now. So let's go, Ambassador Michael, there's a perception like diplomacy about champagne, putting on a suit, driving those posh cars and enjoying those parties. But these are myths about diplomacy. What are the, let's say, a retired diplomat, but still also serving diplomat? What are the realities? What are the myths about diplomacy?
Okay. Well, there are two examples that I would like to give about reality of diplomacy. Former UN Ambassador Andrew Young always had what he called fried chicken diplomacy. And what would happen would be that Andrew, and I know Andrew Young very well personally. We are both from in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've known him on a number of different occasions and still engage with him now. But Andrew's mother would often come to the United Nations, where he lived actually at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and she would fry chicken for Andrew and for a lot of the diplomats that he would invite in for dinner and engagement. More was done over those chicken dinners than was done in some of the formal dinners where everything was plush. The current UN ambassador from the US is Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is a young lady who I have tremendous respect for. She does what is called gumbo diplomacy. She's from the state of Louisiana. And in Louisiana, people cook gumbo, which is a sort of a seafood kind of thing. So she cooks gumbo and brings people over for conversation. That's when diplomacy really happens. You know, I've been to some really phenomenal parties, really plush things at embassies, and where there were princesses present from different countries, and presidents and prime ministers and all those folks. Well, some things happen in those meetings, but the most substantial things happen when we sit down at a cafe somewhere and just have a conversation, or when we're sitting down at a sporting event, simply having a conversation. That's where real diplomacy really takes place. So, yeah, you ride around in these bulletproof cars. Well, that makes sense in some instances, because there are also people who want to kill you if you represent an interest that they are drastically opposed to. So
Right.
the car is a form of protection. So yes, there is protection, but at the same time, the real substantial diplomacy takes place when you are in a casual conversation. I remember casual conversations with presidents of different countries, and no big fanfare around, but we did more in those casual conversations. And then we simply brought that back to our staffs, and they were able to put it in the right kind of language and then transmit what we had done back to our separate governments, and then things were able to happen. But the substantial thing happens in the conversation.
Absolutely. I like the way you brought, like, just simple conversation. That's where things start. That's where our policies begin. And then you push it, you implement it. So let's go a little bit from there. And thank you very much for building the foundation of what diplomacy is. Now, how is the diplomacy related to governance? How does the one shape the other? Or how does the one determine the effectiveness of the other?
Well, you know, a diplomat represents his or her government. Now, if the government you are representing does not have policies of good governance, and good governance having to do with respect for human rights, respect for individual rights, respect for peace and prosperity, respect for economic development, that is a shared economic development where all of the people share in economic development and not just those in the ruling class or in certain families. Well, if your government practices good governance, then it gives you a moral edge to talk about good governance with other people. Now, if you happen to be from a government where good governance is not important, then your diplomacy just might reflect the absence of that importance in good governance. Mm-hmm. Then it becomes your responsibility to help bring your government into the camp of nations that practice good governance. I've always believed that a diplomat is not only responsible for carrying the message of his or her government to other people, but it's also carrying the message from other governments back to his or her government. For example, if you're representing a nation where good governance is not important, it might be to your best interest to try to help your government get back in line with national and international norms. So there is a relationship between diplomacy and governance, because as a diplomat, you represent a government, and you cannot get outside of that context of representing the government. Otherwise, you have no power or authority to negotiate anything.
Yeah.
If you're just out there doing it all by yourself and on your own,
Absolutely.
but that's of no value.
Yeah, perfect. So it's what I hear from you is essentially saying that fix your government, fix your
Yeah.
governance, then your
Absolutely.
diplomacy is fixed. And that brings to my my last question, and I'll just give it to a Q&A from the audience. What are the key challenges facing Africa that need to be fixed for us to strengthen our diplomatic and a little bit strengthen our strategic security at a global concept of affairs?
Well, I would encourage every African young person, middle-aged person, or whoever who's interested in the future of the African continent to get a copy of Africa 2063 and read Africa 2063. Back in 2013, when the African Union was doing a 50-year celebration of the 50th anniversary of the OAU, which then evolved into the AU, it also did something that I thought was absolutely brilliant. It looked at the past and then it projected into the future. So in 2013, you were looking back 50 years, and then you were projecting to 2063, which is 50 years beyond of 2013.
Yeah.
And so the African Union has developed in collaboration with African governments a plan for 2063, which will have several things in it. Of course, I want you all to read it, but I'm going to give you some bit of a summary of what's in 2063 for those who haven't read it. In 2063, the African continent is looking to be unified in terms of having a common currency,
Yeah.
in terms of being able to travel anywhere throughout the African continent without having to have passports and all that to move from one nation to the other, where all of the regional economic communities will have harmonized trade regulations. Why that is critically important. Presuppose I represent a large international corporation, and I want to do business in Tanzania. Well, if I'm going to do business in Tanzania, I ought to recognize that Tanzania is a part of the EAC. So you have Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda all in a common market scenario. So I need to be able to do business with all 5 of those nations, not just with one. So if I'm going to do business in Southern Africa, I need to be able to do business with everybody in SADC or ECOWAS. It doesn't matter, whatever the area is. So harmonizing those trade regulations is absolutely important. Africa is seeking to be peaceful, prosperous, and stable, creating its own wealth. What I want to see Africa develop by 2063 is the mechanism, power, and authority to do value-added productivity from its raw material. Unfortunately, now, Africa, which is the richest continent with raw materials, most of this raw material is taken somewhere else before it's made into a value-added product, and then it's sold. Well, Africa needs the mechanical industrial capacity to create value-added products from its own raw materials, sell its excess, but then make rich people on the African continent, and not just rich families of powerful people and presidents and all that kind of stuff, but where the average citizen on the African continent has a sustainable income to provide for his or her family in a substantive way. But everybody, please, 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 if you don't hear anything else I've said today, get a copy of Africa 2063, read it and understand where the African continent wants to be by 2063 and help it get there before 2063.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And one more quick, Ambassador Michael. What makes a good diplomat? What are the key things that makes a good and excellent diplomat? Traits, attitude. Yeah.
The ability to listen and the ability to be empathetic, the desire to understand, and the desire to actually want to do good. If you can listen well, understand well, have a desire to want to do good, and you are supported by your government in doing it, you can change the world.
Perfect. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. Really incredible. Thank you very much. I think I sent a stage for more questions. I believe they have more questions from the audience. For now, I'll hand over mic to Matilea to handle the Q&A questions. So if you have questions, raise up your hand gently. Be a good diplomat, listen, like Ambassador Mike was saying, and everything will go smooth. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the very enlightening conversation between our ambassador and Mr. Enoch. And yes, I hear that the best things happen when people have conversations. So I would love more than anything to have people have questions for our ambassador and Mr. Enoch. And I think Mr. Fedaku Yehu Walashe. Yes, please. You have a question?
Thank you so much. This is Dr. Kadu from Ethiopia, Jijiga University. Nice to meet you, Ambassador. I'm really happy and excited to be part of this program. And thank you, Enoch, for such an opportunity. And again, thank you for bringing such a wonderful, experienced person for the session. This is what we need to learn each other. Ambassador, I'm really happy to meet you, and I have two simple questions, and I'll read those issues. I really wonder how you explain the topic, the issues, and the concepts, and especially diplomacy versus governance and government. Their positive correlation is explained well, and I'm really excited about it. And from your experience as an ambassador, can you say something about the relationship between diplomacy and building peace and security specific to the two countries? Like if there is a diplomacy relationship between Ethiopia and Sudan, and what peace and security issues are going to be linked with being a good diplomat is my first question, maybe if I explained it clearly. The second one is, I believe that a diplomacy linked with the strategy. A strategy is the art of creating power. The power of two countries is going to be created by a good diplomacy. As you said, the governance is directly linked with diplomacy. I personally believe that in addition to the diplomacy, which is there to represent the government, its own country or government, individuals are also diplomats. I believe that when I go out to Uganda for some task, I'm also a diplomat and representing my country, representing myself, and I have to be a diplomat. So what do you recommend for us, for your team, which is here in African Rivers program, to become a good diplomat individually, not in the form of position, not in the form of assigned by some government leaders or the country. Individually, what I'm supposed to do to become a good diplomat for my country, in addition to those humanity personality issues, what do you recommend, and how was your experience while you were a diplomat, an ambassador? How was your experience, individual experience, that makes you individual diplomat? That was my question. Sorry if I lengthened my speech. Thank you so much.
First of all, on peace and security, the best way that nations can guarantee peace and security on its borders is to be good neighbors to its neighbor. I remember back when Sudan and South Sudan, prior to South Sudan becoming an independent nation, and unfortunately, what led to some of the denigration of relationships between Sudan and South Sudan was that they failed to recognize the principle of good neighbors on your borders guarantee peace and security more than anything else. So diplomacy is always involved in trying to secure better peace and security. I think I probably spent 85% of my time at the African Union dealing with peace and security issues because people were trying to argue philosophically whether or not prosperity and economic growth guaranteed peace and security, or whether peace and security guaranteed prosperity and economic growth. And I think that's a red herring argument because the bottom line is that there is a circular relationship where peace and security, economic growth and prosperity are inextricably bound with one another. So one has to always focus on guaranteeing peace and security. Now, you mentioned what you could do as an Ethiopian traveling to places like Uganda and others. Now, my Amharic is not all that great, but there's an expression in Ethiopia in Amharic that says, Ane Ethiopia we name, which essentially means we are all Ethiopians. So part of what you as an Ethiopian peacemaker and diplomat have an obligation to do is to help Ethiopia find a way that people can transcend ethnic differences and work collaboratively as a single nation, because the power and thrust of Ethiopia as a nation moving forward with leadership on the world stage depends upon Ethiopians working collaboratively with each other, and then setting that example when you travel to other places throughout the world. The best diplomacy is diplomacy by example. Joe Biden used to always say things like, we don't want to lead by the example of our power. We want to lead by the power of our example. So by setting an example of peace and collaboration in one's own nation allows you then to foster those same beliefs outside of your own country. And I know you asked about 3 or 4 questions, but I wanted to try to wrap an answer in that would touch on all 3 of those so that we could get even more questions raised. But I loved living in your nation for 4 years, and I long to see Ethiopia emerge as a unified nation, because if Ethiopia is unified, it is much more able to keep peace in other parts of Eastern Africa and other parts of the globe. Because the bottom line was that had it not been for the strength and unity of Ethiopia in times past, the issues between Sudan and South Sudan would have been much worse. But everybody knew that a strong Ethiopia was able to negotiate in good faith with South Sudan and Sudan because of Ethiopia's strength. So please, 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 for the good of the world, help Ethiopia regain its sense of unity and its sense of power. The world needs Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that answer. And thank you, Dr. Kushikwe, for your question. And in the interest of timekeeping, well, all the people who have questions, please do so and ask their questions quicker than they would normally ask, so that we can get in more questions from other people. So first, I would like to hear from Samuel Loluke.
Yes, thank you. My name is Samuel Lokule. I am a South Sudanese currently seeking refuge in Uganda because of the crisis, and then I'm happy to be here in this platform. Yes, thank you, Ambassador, for the wonderful presentation. Yes, my question is, who appoint the diplomats? Is it appointed or voted by the people in the parliament or in the government? They say we need these people to represent us, to be our diplomat. And then two, how can these people be identified that this person is a great diplomat? Thank you.
The question of appointing diplomats depends upon the constitution of different nations. So different nations have different formats based upon their constitutional order. In the US, the president appoints diplomats. Diplomats are then confirmed, well, at certain levels, at the ambassadorial level, you are then confirmed by the US Senate, which is our legislative branch. And as in most nations, you have what is called a career diplomat. That's a person who begins his or her professional career in the Office of Foreign Affairs or Foreign Ministry, and they spend their whole lifetime doing diplomacy. And then you have other people who are politically appointed diplomats who are appointed by a specific president based upon what those persons have done with the rest of their career. And then they're selected. But whether you're politically appointed or whether you're a career, you still have to have the sanctions of the legislative branch of the government. So the uniqueness of each constitutional government determines the process and procedure for the establishment of diplomatic authority. Now, with regard to how do you identify people, you identify people with character, people who are actively engaged in constructive behavior, who are willing to learn, and who have a sense of foreign policy. That's the way diplomats are bred and cultivated.
Thank you very much. And I would love to hear from Malcolm Shihembedza. Shihembedza.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Malcolm.
Okay, thank you for being here. On governance. I would like to ask you, what would you say that institutionalization of government systems in Africa, or would you say that it is the best shot?
I don't think you're very clear, Malcolm.
Yeah, Malcolm, you will break it up.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me type my question in the chat box.
Thank you. And while you type, I would love to hear from Mr. Awoke Wibi. You have your Gmail on your name description.
Yeah, thank you. This is Awek away from Ethiopia. I'm a fellow of Young Africa Leader Initiative East Africa, Nairobi. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, Your Excellency Ambassador. My question is that, most African leaders usually follow, as you said, war to get a political position or other social status. Most consider diplomacy as a weakness. They use a diplomacy to just win others rather than to be a win-win leaders. So what would you suggest to young African leaders to experience the approach of diplomacy? Because most African young leaders this day consider the diplomacy as useless.
Well, you know,
So, yeah,
yeah.
the other question is that, you know, I think the big challenge is that, you know, unable to cultivate the concept of diplomacy to young African leaders due to the existence of comfortable ground to diplomacy. So is there any diplomatic platforms to young African leaders that could enable them to share experience with experienced diplomats?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me respond. The first thing I want to respond to is this notion of war and whether diplomacy is weak. Having been in the military for 20 years and having been a diplomat, I have a perspective that diplomacy is far more helpful in the long run, and it's far more beneficial to human health than war. Diplomacy is much more desirable than war. Tolstoy in War and Peace, and it was a huge book, and I encourage people to read it. One of the interesting things that Tolstoy points out in War and Peace is that war is the most vile, inhumane exercise that humans can ever engage. War should always be the absolute last choice in shaping the direction of the world. War is necessary sometimes, but it's never an inherent good. It may be necessary, but there is nothing intrinsically or inherently good about war. So diplomacy provides nations an opportunity to settle disputes without the loss of life, to settle disputes without the destruction of property. So I encourage peace every day and diplomacy every day over war. Now, how do you get young Africans engaged? Find a way to become engaged in local politics, in your local community. Not necessarily running for office, but attend local political events, attend local community NGO activities, and allow yourself to build a platform from there to work to more national and more international engagement. So there are so many platforms that you can get engaged in, and I encourage you to find those platforms and to do so as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Ambassador Michael. And the next question will be from Mr. God's Power Madodoye. You are not, we cannot hear you. Mr. God's Power.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
Can
can.
Yes.
Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Can you hear me, moderator?
Yes,
Thank
I can
you
hear
very much, is Mr. God. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Just
Thank
speak
you
up, man. We can hear you.
very much, is Mr. God's Power.
Just type your question. Just type your question to speed up time. Just type your question.
Can you hear me? But I can hear you.
Mr. God's Power, it would be best if you could type your question in the comments box and I will read it for you. And while you do
But I'm
so,
hearing you. Can you hear?
Mr. God's Power, if you can, please type your question in the comments box and I will read it out for you. Thank you. And while you do so, I will take a question from Kaho Mbete. Mbete? One more question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Kako. I'm from Botswana. I'm a master's graduate in international relations. I have a question for, before I start, greetings to everyone. I have a question for Mr. Ambassador there. We have this narrative in Africa that, like, for example, I heard you talking about the 2063 agenda for Africa. Don't you think this this vision of having to put these long visions or long ambitions or missions it's a bit now, I can't say outdated, I'm trying to look for the word, but it seems as if every time we set these long ambitions, we don't seem to achieve them, and there's no accountability. Don't you think now it's time that we set something that is much closer, that is very achievable as Africa? Because these long visions, you find out that you're gonna have a president who's going to be changed after the next, and they don't have the same vision. So my question is, okay, did you get my question?
Yes, yes. Now, the advantage of the agenda for 2063 is that it does not just simply project, it also has milestones that are measurable throughout the process leading up to 2063. So Africa is reaching and trying to reach its UN millennial goals, its sustainable goals, its 2063 goals. So there is a combination of goals that Africa is working on as a continent. It is important to have long-term, long-range planning. It's also important simultaneous with that to have milestones that are evaluated every 2 to 3 years to make sure that we are in step with trying to reach those long-term goals. For example, in a more short-term way, Africa is looking for each of the 5 geographical regions of the continent, the regional economic communities, to be integrated in terms of its economic regulations and laws and having common markets in that context. And then for that to develop into a continent-wide common market and a continent-wide integration and harmonization of economic laws and trends. So you have to do both. You have to have long-term planning and at the same time have shorter-term evaluations and monitoring. And you know, a good plan does not change simply because there's a change of power in a particular government. If the people of that nation are committed to the nation stand on target with its goals as a nation. Leaders come and go. Nations live on and on and on. And what I want each of you as leaders of the African continent is to recognize that whatever you do, you are building a foundation that will transcend your time of living and will transcend your political party because you're trying to build the continent. You're not just trying to build yourself and your political party.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your answer, Ambassador Michael. And it would seem we are very short on time, but I would love to get, there's a question here from Malcolm Shihambetsa, that would you say that institutionalization of government systems in Africa is the best shot at having proper governance, and what would you suggest as further solutions to proper governance?
If by institutionalization you mean having laws and regulations codified by parliamentary approval, I think that's exceptional. For example, a president might decide that he or she wants to provide greater space for NGOs. But if they don't then go through the process of structuring a law that actually guarantees that NGOs have more operating space, then it's just something in the president's mind. So codifying and institutionalizing the laws that for human rights and human development is absolutely essential, because then nobody can come around later on and just simply disavow what the previous president or Prime Minister has done.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you to our ambassador. And there's a second question that asks, what is the difference between an ambassador and a diplomat in the stipulated duties?
Well, yeah, an ambassador is the highest level of diplomacy in a bilateral relationship between nation to nation. On an ambassador staff, you're going to have deputy chief submission. You're going to have first, second secretaries in some countries. You have a whole lot of people who work in political affairs, economic affairs, health, and all of that. All of them are diplomats. The one who comes with the full authority of his or her president or his or her government is the ambassador. And when the ambassador is out, then whoever's second in command will take over for those duties. So you have a whole lot of diplomats, but the ambassador, him or herself, is the highest ranking diplomat in a bilateral connection, nation to nation. I hope that was helpful. And may I make a quick statement? You're from South Africa, is that correct, Madam Moderator?
I am from Lesotho. Well, basically
Lesotho.
South Africa.
Okay, good enough. Just a short story. When Nelson Mandela was elected, I was an election observer for the election. I had the opportunity of meeting F.W. de Klerk and interviewing him on the day that Nelson Mandela was elected. And the interesting thing that de Klerk was focusing on was transition of power, which gave rise to Nelson Mandela leading South Africa exceedingly well. But anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. I had read in your bio that you had worked with Nelson Mandela as an observer during the election. And thank you for the insightful session today and presentation.
Thank you. Well, enjoy the rest of the day, and it was a pleasure working with you.
So, yeah, thank you very much. Before you go, Ambassador Michael, we usually ask our special guests to briefly make 3 magical words that can live in the minds of our young leaders. The best engagement, and so what are the 3 magical words, conclusive remarks, quick ones that you can make to our young leaders? Yeah.
Relationship, listening. Of course, I'm violated by adding more than 3 words. Africa 2063.
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. We really, really appreciate the time you've spared out of your busy schedule to share your immense experience as a leader, as a diplomat, as a security expert, as an academic. So if you want to connect with Michael, he's on LinkedIn, connect and follow his work. And to the young leaders, please, I think one of the things that has made me is like leaders come and go, nations go on and on great points. So leaders come and go. So what we do as leaders is not really to us, it's for the next generation. And you leaders might think, oh, I'm still young, I'm not making it in the leadership position. You are the leader right now. Ambassador Michael made his first speech when he was 17. I guess no one here is 17, so you're a bit older than that. So let's go out and make it a great leaders. Otherwise, thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking to you, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Peace be with you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
So to the leaders, to